Welcome to the Clean Library Podcast, where content meets conscience. We believe there are millions of you readers out there desperately searching for a better way to find clean content. Each episode, we will introduce you to a new author of clean books, giving you, your family, and your friends clean options.
Hello, everybody. I'm Marcus Williams, and I'm here with co-host Brock Morris for another great episode of the Clean Library Podcast. Today, we have special guest Jeremy Madsen. By night, Jeremy is the author of clean epic fantasy novels. His debut book, The Pyromancer's Scroll, will be released as a serialized novel starting in the fall of 2024. By day, Jeremy is the operations manager for a nonprofit organization called Latter-day Saints in Publishing, Media, and the Arts, or LDS-PMA. As part of his role, he helps plan the LDS-PMA conference, an annual event with over 80 classes and around 500 participating writers, professional publishers, or publishing professionals, and other media creators. Jeremy lives in Columbus, Ohio with his wife and 2 kids. Welcome, Jeremy. We're glad to have you on the show today.
I'm really excited to be here.
Great. So we're going to jump into the conversation, but first we need to bring Steve, our scorekeeper, in, although I would rather not, because Brock is up 9-5 on our modest lead. Okay. Well, last week it was a commanding lead. This week it's just modest.
You're not catching up.
I'm trying to be kinder. Yeah.
Okay. Well, that's all right. I'm good. I'm a big boy. I can take it. So let's read the 2 truths and a lie, and we'll jump into it. Number 1, in high school, Jeremy wrote extra essays, which he submitted to his English teacher under a pen name. Number 2, Jeremy has gone on archaeological digs in Atarus, Jordan, and in Hukok, Israel. Number 3, Jeremy likes to collect capes, which he wears often to various events. So, number 1, he wrote extra essays and submitted them under a pen name. Number 2, archaeological digs in Jordan and Israel. And number 3, collecting capes. All right. See if we can figure those out as we go. See if the fantasy author wears capes. So, Jeremy, did you always want to write, or were you involved in this organization first and that inspired you to write, or how did your writing journey all happen?
Yeah, so I grew up homeschooled. I was the youngest of 4 siblings. And one of the things that my mother would do in our homeschool was every week she would teach us a set of new vocabulary words. We'd learn about 10 words every 2 weeks. And to help cement our learning, she would assign us to write sentences with those vocabulary words in them. Well, I had 2 older brothers who were very competitive and very much overachievers, and that was too easy for them. And so they started writing stories with these vocabulary words in them. And that's a great way to foster your creativity, because your story just starts going random directions. When you need to use the word gumbo in a detective story, then it leads to interesting places. And so I was watching my brothers write longer and longer and more complex stories until they're at the point by 9th grade, they're each writing stories about 100 pages long. And I had big shoes to fill. And on the one hand, I felt very small. I felt that my writing ability was much less than theirs. Looking back, it's because I was 4 years younger than them.
Right.
And those big shoes also helped motivate me and helped inspire me to fill those shoes and to get better, and really gave me confidence, not confidence. It gave me vision. It gave me vision of, if my brothers can write this well, maybe one day I can too. And we grew up in a very rich, creative, imaginative environment, reading a lot, going to the library every week. And around 8th grade, I started imagining stories in my head, acting them out with a sword in my bedroom, choreographing my own fights and battle scenes, until I reached this point where I decided this is what I love. I want to write stories, and I want to one day publish them, and I want to impact the world with them.
Mm-hmm. Awesome.
And so then in college, I set the goal. Okay, at the beginning of college, I drafted about 10 different story ideas, and I ran it by my family and friends. and said, which of these do you feel like has the most potential, is the most interesting? And then I took one of those ideas and set the goal, I'm going to write this as a full-fledged novel with the intent to publish it. I'd written other stories before that in high school, but I always considered those practice. Now this was the story I was going to publish, and that became the Pyromancer Scroll. My original goal was draft the first draft in 1 year. That turned into 5 years. Then my goal was revise it in 1 year. That turned into 2 years. But now I'm at the point 7 years later or so when I'm ready to start serializing, indie publishing it as a serialized novel in the fall, with the full novel being released in paperback and ebook formats next spring.
Great. So, of course, I mean, I've got to ask the question, because you said that you were homeschooled, but one of your two truths and a lie was in high school. So we're going to have to.
I did go to public high school for 10th, 11th, and 12th grade.
Okay. I mean, I was thinking about maybe it's sliding something in there, but I'm like,
it would be hard to write essays under a pen name when there's only you and 3 other students.
That sounded a little bit more like the investigator Marcus coming out, right? Interrogator. That was just a direct, straight question trying to pin him down.
I pinpoint there's a problem with your story there. All right. Okay. That makes sense. So serialized, how are you planning to release those? Just through your own website, or are you going to use a program or different, other publication, or where are you going to serialize that?
I plan to push it out on various outlets as a way to reach different reader communities. I'm looking right now into Royal Road and Wattpad as both established communities, and Kindlevella, all 3 of those as established communities of readers. I'll be releasing it on my own website, releasing it in a newsletter, and I'm looking into doing videos of me reading each chapter and releasing those on YouTube, and releasing the audio as a audiobook podcast or a serialized audiobook.
Cool. So what led to that decision to go with the serialized version first before the full publication?
I don't have a reader base right now. And whether I was self-publishing or traditionally publishing, to get that first book out there without a reader base means that your first book is going to have a very slow start, and you're working from the ground up. And so I would rather work from the ground up with something that's freely available than something that people have to pay $5 to $10 for, because as a first time author with no reader base, with no track record, that seems like a better path to get people's attention, to get awareness and people reading my stuff. I plan to release about the first third of the book in serialized format, maybe the first half, and then release the whole rest at once as the full book version. And that would be paid people would pay to access that.
Okay. Gotcha. So get them hooked on the story before they have access to the full book.
Yes. And there'll also be some short stories and some extra stories that are thrown into that free serialized format.
Oh, cool. Okay. So, and that's a interesting question, dilemma, problem that any author has, is when you're first starting, how do you build that audience? What do you give away for free? When do you start charging? I mean, that's a question that I think every author has to ask themselves and decide on their own, like in their own marketing plan, which way they're going to go. A lot of experts will tell you a lot of different things. One of kind of the popular notions is that you have a reader magnet or a free short story. Maybe it's a prequel to your book, something like that. Or doing what you're doing, the serialized version of your book. And I don't know. I don't know if one is the best, if it matters genre wise. I mean, what do you think? Do you think fantasy, the serialized version is the way to go? Or what kind of research have you done into that?
So I have the benefit that there are these communities, Royal Road, Wattpad, that have a lot of fantasy readers. Each of those has their own very specific genres that seem to dominate those platforms, but there is still a sizable epic fantasy community on those platforms. if I were doing something like a thriller or historical fiction, I think it would be a tougher climb.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's interesting how different readers of different genres want to consume in a different way, even though it's all books.
Mm-hmm.
That's interesting to me. And I don't know why. Why would a fantasy reader like it this way, whereas a romance reader wants it that way when they're both books? And I don't know. Maybe you have some ideas for that. I don't know.
This is my grand experiment. Ask me in a year. Have you back on the podcast and we'll talk about how it went.
Yeah, absolutely. So what you said when you first started writing it, you had kind of had a schedule that you thought it'd be done a lot quicker. So what was it that drew out that process for you? What did you find caused it to?
Lack of time. I was a college student. I was getting married. I was having kids. I may or may not have been going on archaeological digs. I will not reveal that. And so just having the time, a lot of the first draft I wrote on the bus my first year of college. And then it was something where I'd kind of let it lapse for a couple months and then hit it hard for a month or two. And then I let it lapse for a couple months. The last third of the book I hammered out in about a 2-month sprint leading up to Christmas, because my goal was I'm going to print a first draft copy for all the members of my family as my beta readers. And that was my deadline, was Christmas. And I was done with college at that point. And I actually deliberately structured my work at the time. So I was only working about 3/4 time. I wasn't working full time. So that I had some extra time to devote to my novel. Okay.
So I loved when you were talking about your brothers and using the vocabulary and writing words. One of the things that I remember, I think it was 5th grade. It was either 5th or 6th. Maybe it was 6th. My teacher for creative writing, she had collected greeting cards, Christmas cards, Halloween card, birthday, and she just had this huge stack. And she would have you go up and just grab one. You couldn't go through them and pick them. You just had to go up and grab a card. And then you had to write a story based on whatever cartoon or picture was on that card. And that was the writing prompt. And I think you're absolutely right. The fact that like having to be creative to fit vocabulary words into a certain type of story was kind of that same thing. Like you have this picture first and you have to come up with the story behind it, where it really pushes your creative thinking and creative juices. And I think that was one thing that really helped me build stories.
So there's this concept that's actually been published in the Harvard Business Review that constraints foster creativity, that you are more creative and more innovative when you have constraints than when you have free reign. And that applies to writing, and it applies to clean writing. I know a question you often ask your guests is, do you find it hard to paint accurate imagery through clean writing methods? And what I find is when I have that constraint of I can't just resort to the profanity or the depictions of violence, that it makes me more innovative and more creative. How am I going to approach this battle scene? How am I going to approach this duel? How am I going to approach this assassination scene in a way that I'm comfortable with and that I'm comfortable with middle schoolers reading? Even though I don't write at a middle school level, I want that accessible to them.
Well, that's such a great concept there, and I love that it's backed by data in what you just stated. I think that hits on exactly what we talk about a lot here. Is there anything that you've found, maybe when faced with that constraint and now needing to be more creative, that sort of helps you over the hump then while you're trying to get through that description, or while you're trying to push through from a creative writing standpoint when you're faced with any constraints, but certainly clean would be one of them?
So with these specific constraints, with battle scenes, I usually resort to describing the actions the characters are doing and not the effect those actions are having on the people who are being injured. So I might describe the main character being in the shield line, thrusting with the spear and hacking and blocking blows with the shield. And I may even say, he stabbed an opponent in the shoulder, but I'm not going to describe the blood trickling down the opponent's breastplate, or I'm not going to touch on how the injuries look. I'm describing what the actions are.
That totally makes sense. And probably gives you opportunity then also to explore things like strategy or other components of a battle, right? That don't necessarily have to do with that, but certainly speak to a certain fan base that love to dive deep into some of those other components of a story. So
yeah, in my current book, most of my battle scenes are from the perspective of the general, who, because he's the general, is mainly behind the lines, taking reports, sending troops. And so you don't see a lot of kind of on-screen action. And yes, I have had beta readers say, I love your battle scenes. And I have other beta readers say, I'm not usually big on strategy. And it was kind of hard to follow, but it was still fun to read.
Yeah. And I imagine that's a little more difficult to organize when you're writing, and which leads me to how do you do your world building, or how do you organize your fantasy world?
In college, my major was ancient Near Eastern studies, which was studying the ancient Middle East, studying particularly the Hebrew Bible and the culture and history around that. I love history and I love military history. And a lot of my world building stems from that. I started with, instead of a medieval European-esque fantasy world, which is where fantasy tends to go, I started with a Bronze Age world. And so you don't have stamped coins. You're only dealing with pieces of metal that are weighed out for your transactions. You don't have the mounted knights, the heavily armored mounted knights. It's more classical era shield walls and light cavalry. And that definitely plays a role in how I write my battle scenes. I'm very picky with how battle scenes are depicted in fantasy. Most fantasy that I read does a very lousy job with large scale battles where they don't understand the dynamics. They don't understand the strategy. They focus on a very narrow part of the battlefield and the effect that a few characters have on the overall battle. And battles don't work that way. And so I very much get into the details of, this army has 40,000 troops and this army has 30,000 troops. And here's the terrain, and I'm mapping out the battles. That's my favorite part, is mapping out the battles and the troop movements and the strategic decisions that are being made. And then figuring out how to write that in a way that is easy to read and accessible to those who don't easily follow battlefield strategy.
Yeah, that's cool. I mean, you don't see that a whole lot. And I look at it just, but whether they're battle scenes, whether they're like law enforcement scenes, if it's a crime thriller or whatever, I find a lot of people tend to write those scenes based on their experience of watching TV shows or movies. And they just don't have a real good grasp of what it's like in reality. And sometimes it's about doing research, and sometimes it's about actually calling an expert and talking to them. And a lot of authors just skip that step, and they just don't take that extra effort to make it realistic and just assume they know what they're doing. So I think that's really cool that you really know that background and dive into it and try to make it as accurate as possible.
I like writing fantasy instead of historical fiction because I do not like doing excessive research. And with the fantasy world, I don't have to research all the details of the time period clothing and time period vocabulary and time period technology. I can just make up whatever I want.
Yeah.
Inevitably, you'll get somebody who tries to call you out on it, right? So when it's your fantasy world, you get to play in that realm. And I think it also plays interesting into this concept of writing clean material. When you talked about, getting feedback from people around, oh, I either loved your battle scenes or not. As you've shared your stories, have you gotten any feedback that people say, oh, I like the fact that it's clean, or people say, I wish it was a little bit more graphic? And have you had balance that feedback, or is it mostly just to those who would fall in line with clean material?
So the beta readers that I reach out to are people who appreciate and want clean material already.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think I've ever had someone say, I wish it was more graphic or less clean. I have had feedback. I have a lot of religious and moral themes in my book, and I have had people say this particular scene or this section was maybe a little too preachy, you could say, and dial it back and ground it a little more in the characters and actions instead of just maybe one character monologuing a little bit. I actually had a beta reader. The most graphic point of my book was in the very last scene with the main character in this epic duel. I described some compound fractures as his bones break during this fight. And one of my readers said that was a little too much. And so I took that out, and I looked at it and I said, yeah, that's a little too much for me. So I had the opposite problem.
Yeah.
Which is a good problem to have ultimately, right? Good feedback.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's got to match the rest of the book. So you can't have gory in one section, but not in everywhere else, or graphic, or whatever word you want to use for that. So do you, in your fantasy world, have you come up with your own words or language to use in place of swearing?
I have a few expressions, very much in the vein of Brandon Sanderson, who does this a lot.
Yeah.
Shadows is a big one because darkness and light play a big piece of my world. There's the equivalent of hell in my world is this dark orb that orbits the planet called the Void. And so people will say Void's shadow or something. I still try to downplay it. I don't like using substitutions for swear words if I don't have to.
Yeah.
And I prefer to use other ways, but I do have some of those fallbacks.
Because I find that I'm kind of up on the fence about that, because once you substitute, even if it's a made up fantasy word, the meaning is essentially still the same as whatever the real word was. So, yeah, it's not the word everyone's used to or that you hear or say, but if it means the same thing, then is it really different? It might be different letters, but is it a different, so
something that I ask myself is, how is the word being used? So if a character says bother, or I'm showing an internal dialogue and they say bother, that happened, that's not a swear word. And so if that character says shadows, he got away, that's okay. But if someone is using it as a pejorative to insult someone else, that's more obviously a substitute for what we would use as a swear word in this world. And I don't think I have any of that. I avoid the pejorative use of exclamations.
Okay. And context matters. That's interesting.
Context very much matters. And that's, a lot of some taking the name of the Lord in vain, for example, in a religious context. If you say the name of deity, that's totally fine. But if you're using the name of deity to insult someone or to express your anger, then it's profane.
Yeah. And which is a line. Sometimes I think people just say you can't ever say the name of deity ever. And I think you're absolutely right. It's not in vain a lot of time. You have to look at the context and how it's being said and the meaning behind the word. The way I describe it, sometimes it's a prayer or a plea. And in my opinion, a prayer or a plea to God is a good thing. So that's not in vain, but looking at the meaning or the purpose or the motivation behind that is really what's important.
I agree.
So with your involvement with how did you get involved as a manager for the LDS PMA?
I was an editor at BYU Continuing Education, and my manager at the time was the vice president of LDS PMA, and they were looking for a new operations manager, and I took the job. It's been a wonderful road the last 3 years. I get to work with an amazing group of authors, an amazing group of editors, and other creators. What LDS PMA does that is unique is it specifically gathers people who care about clean content, who care about creating works that are uplifting, that are edifying, that are full of light. And that's something I have not been to other writing conferences besides the LDS PMA conference, but I have heard from other people and I have seen, I'm on a few email lists of some other author organizations, and I see the books and the writers that are their keynote speakers. And I'm like, I'm glad I'm where I'm at, because I don't want to go listen to a horror writer be the keynote speaker, for example.
Yeah. So for our listeners, is the organization only for members of that church, or can anyone join who has the same values or goals?
So the organization is specifically intended for Latter-day Saints as a gathering place for them, but we welcome anyone who is comfortable being in that environment, who is a creator motivated by their faith in God, and who wants to write clean and uplifting work.
Okay, awesome. And go ahead, Brock.
Well, I was going to ask, so being that closely involved with an organization like LDS PMA, how has it influenced or impacted your journey as an author? You're doing it professionally, obviously being involved with that group. And then how have you found that it's given you access to more resources, or impacted the way you wrote or decided to publish, or any influence there?
It has definitely impacted my understanding of the industry. I get to work with a lot of publishers and a lot of editors, and I get to see that side of it. Often authors only associate with other authors, and there's often this attitude among authors of distrust or ambivalence towards publishers. They don't understand the pressures that the publishers are under. Mm-hmm. And in some ways, I understand the publishing side more than the author side. And I understand the publishing model. I understand the margins, the thin margins that are involved, especially for small presses. I understand that publishers want to publish great books just as much as authors do. And often publishers have a much better idea of what books will do well and how to make a good book than authors do. It also has shown me that this doesn't have to be a competitive industry. This can be a very collaborative industry, and it's led to a lot of ideas of how I can collaborate with other authors to help their visibility grow at the same time they're helping my visibility, that cross promotion and that idea of growing the whole pie. The best thing we can do for each other is to get a larger percentage of Americans reading books and buying books. And the more amazing quality books are out there, the more that will happen.
I love that. That's great insight. And it seems so just logical and obvious, but it's not. I mean, I see all the time in author groups, people worry that even if they're posting something for critique, that it's going to get stolen, or that they can't, there's this competition. And if you believe that it's a competition, number one, I could never live like that where I'm constantly competing with everyone around me. But number two, do you assume that people only read one person, one author? Some of the best ways I've found new books or new authors is through collaborations, where one of my favorite authors collaborated with someone else, and I say, oh, that person's good, so I'm going to read their books too. It's such a big thing, yet it doesn't make any sense why we don't collaborate more.
I agree.
For sure. So with your understanding of the publishing industry, you said that you are planning to indie publish your book. So what led to that decision, given you probably have more knowledge than most?
The unchanging fact of the industry is it is incredibly oversaturated with books and with authors. There are about 30 to 40 million titles available through Amazon, with around 3 to 4 million new titles published every year. That's gone up about tenfold in the last 20 years.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't change whether you're traditionally published or whether you're self-published. That doesn't change even if you're with one of the big 5 presses. You're still competing with all of those titles. And so as I was looking at my particular roadmap, and there is a time and a place for traditional publishing, and I hope to get to that point because it has a lot of advantages, especially with distribution. But as I was looking at my path as a first-time author, I thought I can either spend 6 months working my tail off to get in the door with an agent or a small press, and then potentially another 6 months to get from that agent to a big press, or I could work my tail off for 6 months to build my readership platform and get a head start on that. And for me and my goals, and the other attraction of self-publishing is you get a larger share of the revenue. And so I made the calculation that based on my skills and the time available to me, I figure I can sell about as many books self-publishing my first book as traditionally publishing my first book, because most of the marketing will be on me either way. And so I'd rather make higher royalties on that many books and have full creative control over the process, even if it means more work, than maybe go with a press that isn't my first choice because I'm not a big name enough to get in with my first choice.
Yeah. So very, very calculated decision-making process there, which I don't think a lot of people do. I think a lot of people just dive into it. They want one way or the other and they just go for it. They don't actually think through all of those different, all the different things that can impact your decision and the money and your audience and all that stuff. So I think that's really great advice for any authors listening. Is there's a lot to think. It's a business. There are business decisions involved in publishing your book. It's not just a creative process, especially if you want, unless you're just looking to say, I published a book. If you actually want readers, it's a business. You have to run it like a business and make decisions like you would for any kind of business. Right.
I'm also looking for ways to innovate the self-publishing model. That's part of the reason I'm doing this serialized release. I'll also be exploring alternative sources of revenue, possibly a subscriber-based super fan source of revenue as a way to, because the traditional self-publishing model, the way that most people go about self-publishing, is not very effective for most people and yields very little result for a lot of effort. And that's something I'm trying to bring in other models and other ideas from other kinds of content creators, the kind of the online influencer model, or the some ideas from online courses and people who sell some of those business ideas to create a different revenue and a different business model.
Yeah, because I think the industry is ripe for changes or disruption, if you will. So that's awesome that you're looking into different avenues to try to make that happen and see what works and what doesn't. And you're going in with your eyes open, knowing that these are trials. That we're going to try this, we're going to try that, see what happens, see what works, and again, like a business, pivot. When
exactly.
when you see things working or not working, it's kind of that lean business model where you take the data and you collect it and then you pivot and go where, and it doesn't always end up being what you thought it was going to be when you start.
Yeah. Could we pivot back to the topic of clean content? I had some thoughts.
Yeah, absolutely.
About clean content. So as we talk about clean content, we often talk about it as a preference choice that certain authors prefer to write the sort of content, and certain readers prefer to read that. in the same vein that maybe someone would prefer to read sci-fi instead of a thriller. I think that's a cop-out, because as we talk about and think about clean content, it's rooted in something much deeper than preferences, than personal preferences. Clean content and standards of clean content are rooted in our moral and religious heritage. So you think about, what do we mean by clean? We're usually talking three things. We're talking avoiding sexual content, and that's based in the religious value across many different religions, that the body is sacred, that sexual intimacy is sacred and should be private and should not be on display in any media form. We're talking about violence and limiting depictions of violence, which goes back to that basic moral tenet that violence is anathema to a virtuous society. And we're talking about language, which some of that is going to be, like we mentioned, avoiding taking the name of deity in vain. A lot of profane language is also bringing in sexual terms. And so it's violating that sexual chastity value, or language that is simply offensive and affronting, which violates moral standards. So when we pretend that clean content, the choice to write clean content, is just a personal preference, we miss the fact that if many people agree that this something is morally wrong, that's because they think there is a impact on the society when that is embraced. And my choice to write clean content, my choice to advocate for clean content, is rooted in the personal belief I have that non-clean content is destructive, that a society that has a diet rich in the violent, the crude, the vulgar, the profane, that society is going to deteriorate, that over time you might see a decline in family health, you might see a decline in quality relationships, you might see a rise in violence. And so when I advocate for clean content, I don't do it kind of in a holier than thou, shame on you for engaging in this stuff sort of way. It's in the same vein that a dietitian might say, we as a society eat way too much salt and fat, and it's leading to diabetes and heart disease. It's that same concern that I see the media, certain parts of the media, completely saturated in filth, and I'm seeing the detrimental effect that's having on our society.
Yeah, thank you. Love it.
Beautifully said. Yeah.
And that's why I love this podcast, because you're out there advocating clean content. People want clean content. And I want to take that a step further, not just say there's a demand for clean content, but we need clean content. We need a higher percentage of clean content and a lower percentage of non-clean content.
Yeah, absolutely. And, a lot of the problems that we've talked about, of how do you find it? How does it get labeled? How do you access it? That's the struggle. And that people have, is that they want it. And I'm sure it's different for everyone, but I think you're right. For a lot of people, it's a much deeper reason for wanting it, because of their moral or religious beliefs. So how do you go out and find that or consume that? Or how do you teach your kids? Because your kids they're going to have access to all types of content.
Yeah.
No matter what you do, they go to a public library, a school library, unless you lock them in their room, they're going to have access. So how do you instill not just the rules that we only watch or listen to certain things in our house? How do you instill the desire in them and the deep understanding that we do this because we believe that this is what you need in your life, and there's reasons for it, and it has all sorts of repercussions otherwise, outside of just a 2-hour movie or a 300-page book.
Yeah. And I think the analogy to a nutritionist, actually, I think that's a really powerful analogy, Jeremy. And I think it's the relations are fraught with sort of the same challenges, which is, what we consume has an impact on our health, right? Whether that's consuming food and what we drink, or what we choose to read or watch, or all of that has the same impact. And just as in the environment of nutrition, people can get very, very strong in their opinions of it and shame those who decided to have a cheeseburger today or had a slice of cake or something like that, and say, no, you can never do that. And that's also not the intent here, right? Isn't to shame people because they chose to consume something that we might not consider as clean. But that at the same time, overall, you're trying to eat a diet that is healthy, that's cleaner, right? That's better for your body. And ultimately the outcome is going to be, you're going to be healthier as a person, your family is going to be healthier, and that has an impact on society. So I love a lot of the lines that you can draw there in our approach to it. It's how do you just become a healthy person in general? And if you're steeped in dark content all the time, that will have an effect on you. Just as if the only thing you ate was junk food all the time, then you would eventually, your health would deteriorate. And so I think, I don't think I'd tied those two together, but I think that's a great analogy.
Yeah. And to carry that analogy further, certain food, junk food, people eat it because it's addicting. It tastes really, really good, and it satisfies that immediate craving. And certain content is addictive. When you have sexual material in your book, when you have raunchy material, that is hormonally stimulating. And there are going to be people that are seeking out that content specifically to get that hormonal fix. And I think you could create a spectrum where you have hard pornography on one end, but there's not a clear line saying this is pornography, this isn't. There's pornographic material in erotic literature and in sexualized literature, all the way down that spectrum to hard pornography. And the reason that a lot of writers turn to that, one is peer pressure. Two is that hooks certain people, and certain people are specifically looking for that. The flip side is you have a huge audience of people that are specifically trying to stay away from that. And part of my marketing plan is making very clear in my marketing, in my descriptions of my books, my back cover blurb, even like the title on Amazon, this is clean. And here's what I mean by clean. It doesn't have this, it doesn't have this, it doesn't have this. And I hope to attract those kinds of readers. And I hope that becomes more of a standard in the industry of people being more upfront about what their book contains and what it doesn't.
Yeah.
Well said.
Absolutely. And I think even in a world where people have different levels of what they believe is the moral boundary or the line that they draw, they still need to be able to see or know in order to find what they find uplifting and basically that's going to be healthy for their mental health and spiritual health. It's not just your physical health that you need to worry about.
Yeah. And I can tell the difference when I pick up a book that has stuff in it that does not meet my standards and my values, and I start getting into that, and then I put the book down, I feel worse. I feel the same way I feel after eating a double cheeseburger with fries and no veggies.
Yeah.
That sickness to your stomach that just stays with you, except, it's that moral, that emotional and mental weight.
And one of the things, sorry, Marcus.
Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, one of the things we talked about before on this program too is how unlike, the world of nutrition, you can go to a grocery store and you know exactly where the produce section is and where you can find healthy or in what stores sell healthy. One of the big gaps that exists right now in this industry across the board is if I want to exercise that choice, it's very difficult to find trustworthy content from a source or platform that has done some due diligence to provide it, or even just search parameters in general for filtering what you find on Amazon or anywhere else. It just doesn't exist without just having to dig to find it. And that's a challenge.
And just like what you were saying, if you start eating healthy, then the day that you have sugar or something unhealthy, you can feel that impact a lot more than if you're constantly eating unhealthy. And I think just like you said with reading. So, well, I wish we could just keep going, but we're about out of time. So we need to jump into your 2 truths and a lie and see if we can figure it out. So I'm going to remind everyone, first one is in high school. Jeremy wrote extra essays, which he submitted to his English teacher under a pen name. 2, Jeremy has gone on archaeological digs in Adarus, Jordan, and Hukok, Israel. And 3, Jeremy likes to collect capes, which he wears often to various events. So, Brock, what do you think?
So I have no idea. I mean, I think everything you've shared, I could see all of these being true. I wish I could say I have some deductive reasoning that's going to allow me to pick something that might be close. I really don't. Like, I have no idea. So I'm just going to pick, I'm going to pick number 1. I'm going to say that's a lie. That I could see you as somebody who wrote extra essays, but maybe you didn't do it under a pen name. I'm going to pick out some specific that I think might be a way to shake us off the scent. But so I'm going to say 1 is that.
Okay, so it sounds like from your major in college that you probably have been on archaeological digs. Who knows if it's those 2 places? That's the question. As an epic fantasy writer, I'm going to guess you have a cape, but do you collect capes? So that's the thing. You put in these little twists that.
Yeah, he's really good at that.
Yeah, so they're very specific. But I'm going to agree with you, Brock. I'm going to go with number 1 as the lie.
You are both wrong.
Oh,
so it's your chance, Marcus, to get ahead, and you blew it. I did write extra essays in 11th grade English. There were certain assignments where I had things I wanted to say, but I didn't want to risk my actual grade over it. And so I would write extra essays. One in particular, we did a literary criticism essay for The Great Gatsby. And I don't even remember what my actual essay talked about, but I submitted this bonus essay under the name Quillen Inkwell that talked about how the characters in The Great Gatsby break all 10 of the 10 commandments and then showing how their lives just completely fall apart into turmoil and death as a result. I read it the other day. It was quite entertaining.
Funny. So which one is the lie?
The lie is the archaeological dig. So I looked into both of those. I wanted to go on an archaeological dig. I was at Brigham Young University, and there were professors who ran digs in both of those locations. Things just never worked out for me to actually be able to go. And then I do collect capes. I have one with me right now. And I would wear capes to high school. I would wear capes to college. I've worn capes to conferences, to community events. It's my part of my brand.
Love it.
Awesome.
Love it.
All right. Well, I didn't catch up, but I didn't fall further behind. So we're going to stick with that. Well, Jeremy, thank you so much for being with us today, you and your cape. It was a great conversation. I love diving deeper into that definition or the meaning of clean and the importance of clean. So thank you so much. For everyone out there listening, please follow, subscribe, share with your friends. We're so grateful to have you here, and we hope that you've learned a lot, and we will see you next time on the Clean Library Podcast.